folks, this is Dr. Emily Scherning with American Resiliency. I'm very excited to bring you a 2050 forecast for Canada. We've had viewers asking for information about Canada since the beginning of the channel. I'm glad today's the day we can start answering your questions. And I have to say, I'm really glad I refused to say much about Canada before I had my hands in the data, because I would have been very wrong about a lot of stuff. Our source text for this video is the CCCR 2019, Canada's Changing Climate Report 2019. I did also consult the 2022 update on that report that says the 2019 remains definitive. This report represents Canada's best consensus climate science. Let's dive in. So Canada is looking at, generally speaking, higher levels of change by 2050 than the United States. Canada as a whole has warmed at twice the rate of the rest of the world. Northern Canada, we're talking about a 3-time multiplier on the warming. Let's look at what I mean by Northern Canada on this map here. This map is from the CCCR. This is allowing us to define our regions here. When we're talking about the north, we're talking about, generally speaking, north of the 60th parallel. The report also talks about the outlook for the Atlantic, Quebec, Ontario, the Prairies, groups several provinces together, and British Columbia. So we're going to go through this outlook region by region. We're going to look at Northern Canada at the end. I don't want to make you wait if you're interested in knowing what's going on in Southern Canada. I'm sure those are our areas of greatest interest. Just a note about that for the Americans tuning in, it's worth looking at where Canadians live. You can see in this map here that the population in Canada is tremendously concentrated towards the south. So when we're talking about the outlook for Northern Canada as being especially challenging, that is alarming from the perspective of traditional lifeways. It's alarming from the perspective of any sort of ecology, from the perspective of greenhouse gas release from thawing permafrost, all super bad. But when we're talking about what's going to happen to most of the people who live in Canada, when we talk about Southern Canada, we're talking about the majority of our individual concerns. Now, there's good news and bad news in the regional outlooks for Southern Canada. We're going to look at the bad news first. I know many people have looked to British Columbia as a potential climate haven. I'm sorry to say we are looking at higher rates of change there than anyone would like. We're also looking at high rates of change in the prairies with challenges as well as opportunities. Overall, change looks highest to the west, lowest to the east. The Atlantic has seen the least change so far, then Quebec, then Ontario. Let's dig in. We're going to do a summary by region, and I'm going to show you how you can get very detailed info for your home area in Canada in a little bit. So back to British Columbia to start. Of course, of Southern Canada, this region has experienced the highest warming so far. The trend is expected to continue with disproportionate warming for British Columbia. British Columbia has also been experiencing unique regional drops in winter precipitation. Overall, total precipitation is expected to increase across Canada by 5 to 9% in the south, but British Columbia, unfortunately, has been seeing less total water in the winter and is likely to have more fire activity in the summer as we continue to move towards 2050 due to fairly strong projected drops in seasonal summer precipitation. British Columbia is also where we've seen the most dramatic glacial declines documented in the report, and it's where we expect to see some of the biggest changes in how water moves across the landscape as the region transitions from a snow-dominated to a series of rain-dominated watersheds. Let's explore on the tool map. This is the official Canada tool map. You can see there are a ton of different types of projections you can look at on this map. We're going to be using RCP 4.5 modeling. We're likely to come in around 2 degrees of total global warming, and that best fits the RCP 4.5 model. On this tool, less warming is the same as RCP 4.5. More warming is equivalent to RCP 8.5. We're going to set the time scale to mid-century for this focus on the worst facing our generation. We've talked about serious challenges facing British Columbia. I also want to highlight some of the opportunities. So take a look at the changes in the growing season here. You might imagine this agricultural production data is my favorite. So here we are in agriculture. You can see we're looking at frost-free season. Let's see what happens when we hit mid-century. Huge change on the map, right? You're getting a ton of additional growing time. Let's see exactly how much, because this time scale, it's hard to see exactly what sort of numeric value we're looking at. Let's zoom in on this valley here. This area is one of the fastest growing places in Canada. Let's see if we can get Kelowna. We can see that under the RCP 4.5 scenario, where we complete energy transition along the pathway that is making energetic and economic sense right now, Kelowna is going to gain almost 31 days of growing season. It's completely wild. And this is a rich agricultural area, beautiful agricultural area. That is a game-changing amount of additional frost-free season for anyone who's interested in production. You know, the challenges facing British Columbia are severe, but if you look at the risk reward, you can see it's also got potentially very high reward. Let's look at some other factors here because I want to show you how if you look on the map, you zoom in on your square, you can get a lot of cool factors. I think that let's look at warmest maximum temperature. It's good to have an idea of how hot something is going to get, right? You can see there we're talking about a potential 2-degree change for your average warmest maximum temperature. And you can get an idea. You're going to want to explore this yourself, but we can look at heat wave length, we can look at nighttime warming, we can look at how many days are going to be super hot. Let's check that out. Way too many more days are going to be super hot. Lots of factors that are going to be very important as you consider the potential of the region and what sort of things you might want to grow there. What sort of extremes are likely to hit you? And when I talk about extremes, I do mean extremes. I mean, Kelowna, what we were looking at right there, they faced just devastating floods due to atmospheric river action back in 2021. Communities in this region were isolated due to those floods. They were very damaging to basic infrastructure. They washed out roads and rails. So when we talk about extreme climate events in this region, when we talk about risk and we talk about reward, they're both very large. I've talked in my forecasts for the American side of the Pacific Northwest that we expect a higher than usual number of extreme events, of natural disasters in that region. That does appear to have an even stronger trend, even higher rate of potential just real extremes. As we look to the north of the border, as we look into Canada, we're looking at a real trend towards extremes. And I'm sorry to share such a challenging outlook for this beautiful region. If you look into the heat data, you'll see that the warming expected is very substantial. I was quite taken aback by it myself. It was much more change than I expected, higher levels of change. While there is potential reward in British Columbia, you're going to really need to roll with it to take advantage of those longer growing seasons. And risks are high, higher, I think, even than in the prairies. Let's talk about the prairies now. They're where we see the biggest regional potential for increasing agricultural productivity. So let's look at the growing seasons projections there. Here you can see the frost-free season for the prairies based on sort of historical data going to 2005. Looking towards mid-century, you see sort of an all-over change, a gradual change. That slightly lower rate of change means that the risk to reward ratio is going to be a little bit better, a little bit safer. And let's see what that's going to mean, this color shift for the growing season, say around Saskatoon. We're talking about maybe 15 days of additional frost-free season, and that's consistent across the prairies, that you're looking at more like 15 to 20. Still huge, particularly when you're talking about maybe getting an extra cycle of legumes in, right? Huge deal. But the change is not as enormous as like a 30, 35, even 40-day increase in frost-free season. More likely you're going to be able to have a little bit of stability in there that'll help hold the landscape together, hold the ecosystem together. It's not to make light of the challenges facing the region. So the precipitation trends overall are good. We're looking at a 5 to 6% increase in annual precipitation expected by mid-century, but this is a region where there is a strong potential for summer droughts. There's this pattern that we've seen in the US forecasts where summer drought is going to become very common in inland North America. Let's pull that up from a US projection and take a look at the southern edge of the pattern. All right, so here's precipitation patterns for the summer projected for the US. We can see big drying trend inland, but look, there's the edge of the pattern right here in these projections for the US where it's going to flip, where instead of a drier summer, you have a wetter summer. This is the big question in the outlook for the prairies of how much potential we're going to be able to unlock is where does this border continue? How close to the border do we get the flip into the wet pattern from the dry pattern? The CCCR report is very clear. They're not sure where that boundary is going to lie. If we end up with a full-on summer drought increase in the prairies, we do expect substantially increased wildfire in the region if we combine the summer heat and the drought. However, if that rain boundary manages to flip fairly near the border, and it's expected to flip very close to the US-Canada border, That would be very hopeful. That would reduce the threat of wildfire, which we don't need any more of that, right? It's terrible to see the lungs of the planet burning up in northern Canada. It's very sad. It's worth noting, getting a little more positive, that the prairies have been bucking a trend on snow. Across Canada, there's been a trend for reduced winter snow cover, but snow cover has been locally increasing in the prairies in the winter. We want the snow to stick around here. A lot of the local water system is fed by snowpack in the western mountains. So if we continue to see this short term, it's not statistically significant yet, trend of increased snowpack, that could mean milder changes to this water system, again, bringing down that big red flag of fire danger. In the prairie, these water systems are going to be critical, and I'm sorry that I can't get you more concrete information. There's a lot hanging in the balance. And this is the only region of Canada where we see the report express any serious concern about future water availability. If the cards fall wrong, if the snowpack declines faster than expected, if the border for that summer precipitation pattern flip is farther north than we'd like it to be, it could be hard to get enough water to this potentially very valuable cropland. As we move a little bit further east, our water concerns shift. There's not a lot of concern that Canada will have too little water in the east. There's increased concern about urban flooding and other water management issues related to the extreme abundance of water in the forecast. And let's talk about that with Ontario. Ontario, I have wonderful news for you in that you are very boring in the report. You have the least change. You are the least exciting. That is exactly how you want to be in a climate projection. Trend wise, of all the regions we're going to discuss and have discussed, your warming is unexceptional. It's on trend with the rest of Canada. It's likely to continue to be concentrated in the winter, which everyone would prefer, I think, a milder winter to a flaming hot summer, looking nice for you. You're looking at milder, wetter winters. Again, that's not necessarily delightful to have it be like rainy and gray all the time, but I think most people would prefer that to a long stretch of really hot days. Your total annual increase in precipitation looks to be about 6%. Let's use this opportunity to look at the mapping tool again and see how this very local information can be used in an urban context. So in Toronto, say, very built urban environment, the question of how hot it's going to get and what our energy loads for air conditioning are going to be are pretty significant, right? If we look at the average warmest maximum temperature, we can see there's going to be a significant change. It's going to feel, on average, substantially warmer in the summer. But what's that going to mean? In terms of heat waves, we can see that we expect heat waves to stay. For a US viewer, this looks pretty mild. A 5-day heat wave, doable. It's a challenge one can achieve with a modern energy grid. If we look at how hot those days are going to be in those heat waves, we do expect there to be substantially more days over 32, and you're not going to like this. Looking at a few more days over 34 as well. However, we are not measuring this in weeks to months as we are in the American Southwest. We're looking at days of very hot days, like 3 additional days of very hot days. This could be worse. This is the sort of thing that you can plan for. When you want to talk about the increased rain, we want to talk about flooding. If we look at the average projected change in the maximum 1-day precipitation, we're talking about 4 millimeters increase. A substantial increase for a city that already has occasional flooding problems. But if you look at some of the cities that we've examined closely in the American Southeast, we're talking about a difference in more like 2 centimeters, not a 4 millimeter, like a 2 centimeter difference in max 1-day precipitation. When we look at these changes to Toronto, we're looking at changes that are pretty mild in the context of a highly urbanized, highly desirable city. It should be very comforting to you to see that this looks like it will continue to be a very desirable urban area in the future with relatively mild levels of change. Okay, let's move on to Quebec. I've had a lot of viewers write in from Quebec. It is looking fairly stable. Like we hypothesized near the Canada-US border, it looks pretty stable like we predicted. However, when I was trying to extrapolate for Quebec from the US, which I know I try not to do that, right? Let me tell you, I'm glad we didn't say anything firm because I was not anticipating how much additional precipitation Quebec was likely to get. We're talking about an 8% annual increase as we move towards 2050. And you've already gotten like a 10% increase in the last 30 years. So this is talking about very serious amounts of water falling on the province. Your warming in Quebec has been concentrated in the summer and the fall, not the winter like Ontario. So that's a very different pattern of seasonality. And we do expect that summer warming is going to continue. And it can be concerning because it's correlated with wildfire, like we're seeing this year. So the additional precipitation, which you're likely to get, which for you will definitely include summer precipitation. Unlike in the prairies, the report thinks that this is going to largely offset the risk of wildfire. We're looking at like a yellow flag for you for wildfire, as opposed to British Columbia and the prairies regions, which we're looking at more like a red fire, definite increased wildfire in the trend. Hopefully, these trends will hold true. This year, we'll remember it as a bad year. We won't see this as a pattern of ever increasing wildfires in Quebec. A very hopeful sign. I know that this year has been rough, but we got to look at the overall regional outlook when we try to assess how seriously to take threats moving into the future. Before we move on to the Atlantic, I want to look at a couple of factors for Montreal because it looks really nice. Check out your relative flooding risks for Montreal. We always worry about urban flooding. It can be a serious problem in a dense area. This does not indicate a super serious need to make modifications to infrastructure. Fantastic. Let's look at heat waves for Montreal. It is looking like there will be an increase there, but how hot is it going to be compared to what we saw over in Toronto? Looks like a smaller total increase. And let's look at those mega hot days. Again, smaller total increase in super hot days from Toronto. So Montreal is looking like another desirable, beautiful city, moderate levels of change, lower levels of change than large US cities, and in this case, relative good water infrastructure for your future needs. Nice. Finally, let's talk about the Atlantic. Offshore, there's this projection for crazier waves, bigger waves off the coast, and a longer wave season. But when we look on land, terrestrially on land, this region is looking relatively protected, like pretty good. I don't want to minimize your experience. I mean, I know people in this region, my friends in Halifax have told me they've experienced a lot of change. That Hurricane Fiona was a pretty wild experience. So I understand when we talk about relatively protected, relative is relative as we look towards 2050, but your level of experience change is lower than the rest of Canada and is likely to stay lower. You're looking at maybe a 4% increase in total annual precipitation. That's less dramatic, less change than other eastern regions of Canada. And that is going to be enough to likely continue to offset wildfire risks. Good news. Your warming has been concentrated in the summer. Let's take a look at how that's likely to impact Halifax as we move towards 2050. Many of us who hate extremely hot days, this number is going to be delightful for Halifax. That's fantastic. When we're talking about heat waves in Halifax, really very minor continuing issue. When we talk about heavy precipitation, we are looking at increases, but this is an area where there is already substantial infrastructure built for storms, and we're going to need to continue to prepare for extreme coastal weather events in this region. But when we're talking about developed cities that aren't looking at uncontrollable heat in the summer, Halifax looks fantastic. I think it's fun to look at the length of the frost-free season here. We can see it is substantial. We're not going to have tremendous summer heating here, but we will have some retreat of the cold in the winter. This is going to be about 21 days of additional growing time. For many people, the future climate of Halifax would be considered more pleasant, more tolerable than it is today. I think this is a potentially interesting destination in Canada. So looking at Canada's major cities, particular to the east, I have to tell you, relatively, they look great. They look great, better than most US cities of similar size in terms of their stability, in terms of their continuity. Really a good future worth building resilience for. But now we got to talk about the north. So in the report, northern Canada usually means everything north of the 60th parallel. This region is experiencing tremendous change, with tremendous change continuing as we approach 2050. We're talking about a summer with very little sea ice remaining, a mostly open ocean in the summer by 2050. Is very consensus that that is going to happen in our lifetimes. The authors of the CCCR have high confidence that the last summer's sea ice will be, let me show you right up here. This is where there's high consensus the last of the ice will be. It is up in the northern part of the Arctic archipelago. and on the northern coast of Greenland, leaving the Northwest Passage free of seasonal ice. However, they do think that it will be full of chunks of ice that will continue to float down from this remaining iced region. So it won't make for like easy navigation, like some people have wanted to talk about for changing shipping in the Northwest Passage. That'll still be a like iceberg laden passage. And this is just an astonishingly small part of what was once an enormous ice dominated ecosystem. This is going to be the refuge right here for all of your ice dependent species, this small area. In terms of the data, the report is pretty open about the fact that Canada doesn't have a ton of recording stations in the north and really only has data going back until about 1948. However, we do have thousands of years of indigenous knowledge saying that this whole situation is completely abnormal, deeply abnormal. So I don't think that we need to doubt that or doubt any of the seriousness of these findings in the north. The region's continuing change will potentially open up some more area for habitation, but it's looking more non-optimal than some hopeful optimists would like to think. The thawing permafrost in the north is leading to all kinds of weird local geological activity. And the increase in precipitation in the north, and precipitation is forecast to increase all across Canada, but in the north, it's super wild. Under the more extreme models, we're talking about a 33% increase in annual precipitation. All of the subtropical moisture that's living places like Portugal, where Portugal and much of the Mediterranean is experiencing this serious drying trend, all of that is moving up to the top of the world. All that moisture is going to fall down up there. So when we're talking about northern Canada, we're talking about completely transformative change. Southern Canada, a change spectrum with generally higher change to the west and lower change to the east. There's great potential for resilience building in the east of Canada that ought to have some serious focus for Ontario, especially on flooding and water control. But there's great potential all through Canada's most densely populated eastern areas. There'll be an increased need for air conditioning. There'll be a need to consider that as you look at the power and energy needs of the cities as we prepare for the changes that are coming. When we look back to the prairies, we do see an opportunity zone there. We're talking about big changes, increased risk of fire danger, and the degree of that danger is going to depend very much about the summer water availability, where that border for the wet, dry precipitation pattern flip falls. I'm hopeful we're going to get more clarity on that in the 5th National Climate Assessment for the US this November, which is scheduled to be released with a detailed atlas. Fingers crossed that'll give us a peek north of the border. Maybe it'll let us confirm the edge of that summer dry zone. In British Columbia, we're looking at much higher levels of change than I would like to see. Much higher fire risks, many more extremely hot days, serious changes to the local water systems. It's not to say there aren't opportunities there, but you got to go in with open eyes. I know many people have been hopeful about stability in British Columbia. There is potential, but there's not potential for stability. We're talking about extremely high variation within region, as well as unusually high potential for natural disaster. Thanks for joining us today. Please check out your local forecast using the tools we've explored. The link is in the description, and let me know if you have any questions. I'll always do my best to help, and I'm grateful I found these resources so that now I can help. Canada is facing challenges to be sure, but there's a lot of opportunity here as well. I would be particularly excited about opportunities in southeastern Canada with a particular personal interest in the Atlantic region because of the stability and its connection to other relatively stable biosystems. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at North America here. I mean, setting aside national boundaries, this is one of the highest continuity bioregions with the lowest level of change in the world as we look at the 2050 projections. I know change is happening. I know you already felt change, but change is going to happen everywhere. This is where we're looking at some relative stability as this area looks really good. And there's a lot of change happening in inland New York, but it could be positive change. We've explored that before. I think the same is very much true for this southern part of Ontario. I think that we're going to see a warming, productive, potentially contiguous bioregion emerging here. When we look over to the prairies at this tremendous hope, man, I hope that that summer precipitation flip happens nice right here at the border so that we can maximize the potential for the prairies here to continue effective summer output of staple crops. This area here, this area here, this prairie here, where I live down at the southern edge of it, you can see my blue dot there. This is where we have the hope for continuing agricultural production that would allow us to keep exports up. I don't think that in North America we have to worry too much about our food security on the continent, but there are many places where that is not the case. If we have hope of being able to continue to be a major food exporter, that hope is here. And if we get a good flip where you guys get the wet summers, get enough summers to keep the wildfire down, you guys could be the center of that hope. It could be very inspiring. And you know, Cascadia is very strong. Cascadia has a very strong identity. The importance of maintaining this area, even though it's high risk, high reward in both the US and Canada, is critical if we want to be able to produce specialty crops, if we want to keep as many of the cultural traditions alive as we can here. There's not a lot of good territory if we look at the global forecast. If we look between the US and Canada, if we look particularly at inland North America, it's the best place. We're lucky to be here. This land here in North America, it's so precious. It has some of the best outlooks for 2050 in the entire world. We should be grateful for our opportunities to care for this land and to help make the best future we can. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you're able to see the opportunities in this forecast as well as the challenges. I tried not to downplay the challenges. I know there's a lot, but there's also some serious hope here. And we're going to be strongest together. I'm glad we can get ready together too. American Resiliency is a registered nonprofit, a 501c3. We appreciate any way that you want to help us get the message out there, whether it's liking, subscribing, commenting on this post, giving a donation, or volunteering your time. The reach that we have managed to accomplish with these accessible climate messages has only been possible because of viewers like you. Thank you very much for any way that you can help us get the message out there because there is hope and we need to get ready together. Thanks.